Dr. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she adjusted the high-resolution scanner over the sepia-toned photograph. The archives of the New Orleans Historical Society were silent, except for the hum of equipment and the distant rumble of streetcars on St. Charles Avenue. Rain streaked the tall windows, casting wavering shadows across the cramped research room where she had spent the last 3 months cataloguing forgotten images from the 1880s. The work had been monotonous until now. Box after box of faded photographs, most documenting mundane aspects of daily life in post-Civil War Louisiana. Society parties, street scenes, family portraits. Each image required careful handling, detailed documentation, and high-resolution scanning for the Historical Society's Digital Archive project. Sarah had processed over 3,000 images in 12 weeks, her eyes straining from the endless examination of 19th-century faces and places. She had taken this position as a temporary escape from her previous work with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. 7 years of profiling serial offenders had taken its toll, leaving her exhausted and disillusioned with the darkness that seemed to permeate humanity. The Historical Society position had seemed perfect, a quiet refuge where the subjects of her study were safely removed by more than a century. The dead couldn't hurt her. The crimes of the past were complete, their perpetrators long since turned to dust. But as she looked at the photograph before her now, Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had driven her from the FBI in the first place. The instinct that something was deeply, terribly wrong. The photograph itself seemed unremarkable at first glance. 4 young women, sisters according to the faded inscription on the back, posed in the formal style of 1883. Their faces were solemn, almost haunted, their dark Victorian dresses creating stark silhouettes against the pale backdrop. The eldest couldn't have been more than 25. The youngest looked barely 15. Sarah had nearly moved on to the next item when something made her pause. Perhaps it was the way the youngest sister's eyes seemed to plead through the decades, or the rigid tension in their postures that suggested fear rather than the customary stiffness of long exposure times. She decided to run one more high-resolution scan. As the image appeared on her computer screen, magnified to 10 times its original size, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There, clearly visible in the enhanced digital scan, were additional hands, not belonging to the 4 sisters. These hands emerged from behind them, pale fingers resting on shoulders, gripping arms, one hand clasped over what appeared to be the second sister's wrist, in an unmistakable gesture of restraint. The hands were positioned in a way that would have been invisible to the naked eye in the original photograph, carefully hidden in the folds of fabric and shadows. But the digital enhancement revealed them with chilling clarity. 5, perhaps 6 extra hands. Sarah counted again, her pulse quickening. Definitely 6. She leaned back in her chair, the revelation settling over her like a shroud. Someone else had been in that photograph. Multiple people, standing behind the sisters, deliberately concealed from the camera's primary view, but captured nonetheless by the merciless accuracy of 19th-century photographic plates. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed her colleague, Marcus Webb, a criminal historian who specialized in cold cases from the Reconstruction era. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep, despite it being nearly noon. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight with excitement and something darker, "I need you to come to the Historical Society right now. I found something that might connect to your research on the missing women of 1883. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The Laveau disappearances?" Marcus asked, suddenly alert. "Maybe. Just get here." 20 minutes later, Marcus burst through the archive doors, his jacket soaked from the intensifying rainstorm. He was a tall man in his early 40s, with greying temples and the intense focus of someone who had spent years pursuing ghosts through historical documents. Sarah had worked with him before on various projects, but never on something that felt this urgent, this visceral. Marcus Webb had his own obsessions. A former prosecutor who had left the district attorney's office after becoming frustrated with the limitations of the legal system, he had turned to academic research as a way to pursue justice in cases where the courts no longer had jurisdiction. He had published extensively on historical crimes, particularly those involving vulnerable populations whose suffering had been systematically ignored or minimized by contemporary authorities. The Laveau disappearances, as he called them, had consumed 5 years of his life. The name came from Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen of New Orleans, though the disappearances had nothing to do with her or her practices. Marcus had simply needed a shorthand reference, and the name had stuck in his research notes. 12 to 20 young women vanished between 1882 and 1884, their cases never solved, their fates never determined. Until now, he had only circumstantial evidence, scattered references in old newspapers, gaps in family genealogies that suggested tragedy. She showed him the photograph without preamble. Marcus studied it in silence, his eyes moving from the sisters' faces to the enhanced areas where the extra hands became visible. His expression darkened with each passing second. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. How many people were behind them? At least 3, based on the hand positions, maybe more. Marcus pulled up a chair and sat heavily, never taking his eyes from the screen. In 1883 he began, speaking slowly, as if each word required careful consideration. There was a series of disappearances in the French Quarter. Young women, mostly from middle-class families, vanished without a trace over the course of about 18 months. The police at the time attributed it to runaways or women leaving abusive situations, but there were some investigators who suspected something more sinister. "How many?" Sarah asked. "Officially, 12. Unofficially, probably closer to 20. The records from that period are incomplete. There was a fire at the police headquarters in 1884 that destroyed a lot of evidence." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm, humid air in the archive room. "Were any of them ever found?" Marcus shook his head. "Not one." The disappearances stopped abruptly in late 1884, and the whole thing was quietly forgotten. "I've been trying to piece together what happened for the past 5 years, but there's almost nothing to go on. Until now." He pointed at the photograph. "Who are these women? What do we know about them?" Sarah flipped through the documentation that had accompanied the photograph. According to the archive records, they were the Mercier sisters. The notation was sparse, but she found a family name and a street address in the Garden District. Madeleine, Celeste, Marguerite, and Sophie Mercier, daughters of Jean-Baptiste Mercier, a cotton merchant. Marcus was already on his laptop, pulling up historical records and census data. The internet connection in the archive was painfully slow, but eventually he found what he was looking for. His face went pale. "Sarah, all 4 of these women were reported missing in November 1883, 3 weeks after this photograph was taken." The room seemed to contract around them. Sarah looked back at the image, at the sisters' faces, and suddenly understood the expression she had seen there. They had known what was coming. "We need to find out who took this photograph," Sarah said, "and who those hands belong to." The next several hours passed in a blur of research. They discovered that the photograph had been taken at a studio on Royal Street, a location that no longer existed, replaced decades ago by a souvenir shop catering to tourists. The photographer's name was listed as Henri Devereux, a French immigrant who had operated several studios throughout New Orleans in the 1880s. Sarah pulled up city directories from the period, tracing Devereux's business locations. He had moved frequently, opening and closing studios across the French Quarter and Garden District with suspicious regularity. Each location operated for no more than a year or two before Devereux would relocate. The pattern suggested either business difficulties or something more deliberate, a need to avoid scrutiny. Marcus found employment records showing that Devereux had worked briefly as an assistant to several more established photographers before opening his own studio in 1881. References from those employers were scarce, and what little existed was ambiguous. One letter of recommendation, preserved in a collection of business papers, described Devereux as technically proficient but unsettling in his manner, particularly around young female subjects. They located advertisements Devereux had placed in local newspapers, offering special rates for family portraits and promising the latest techniques in photographic art. Several ads specifically targeted families with daughters, offering package deals for debutante portraits and society photographs. Sarah felt her skin crawl as she read them. The language was perfectly proper for the time, but knowing what they now knew about the photograph's hidden details, the ads took on a sinister quality. Marcus found a newspaper article from 1885 mentioning Devereux's death. The circumstances were vague, but the brief obituary noted that he had died in a fire at one of his properties. No family was mentioned, no heirs came forward to claim his business or personal effects. Too convenient, Marcus muttered, reading the article for the third time. Everything about this case, every lead, it all disappears into smoke and ashes. Sarah was examining the photograph again, zooming in on different sections. "There," she said suddenly, pointing at a barely visible detail in the background. "Look at the wall behind them." Marcus leaned in. It was a pattern, partially obscured by the poor lighting and age of the photograph, but with enhancement it became clearer. Wallpaper with a distinctive design of interlocking roses and thorns. "I've seen that pattern before," Marcus said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "In one of the architectural surveys of French quarter buildings from the 1880s. It was considered quite luxurious at the time, imported from France. Only a few wealthy households had it. Can you find out which ones? I can try. The Historical Architecture Database might have records." As Marcus searched, Sarah continued examining the photograph. She noticed something else, something that made her skin crawl. The hand positioned on the younger sister's shoulder, the one identified as Sophie, had a ring. Even in the aged photograph, with all its imperfections, the ring was distinctive. A large stone, possibly a diamond, set in an ornate band. "Marcus, look at this," she said, highlighting the detail. "That ring. Can you make out any distinguishing features?" Marcus zoomed in further, adjusting the contrast and brightness. "It's elaborate, expensive. The setting looks like it might have engravings, but I can't make them out clearly enough." He paused, thinking. "You know, there are estate records from prominent New Orleans families. If someone wealthy enough to own that ring was involved in this, there might be documentation." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, the archive slowly emptying as other researchers left for the day. The security guard, an elderly man named Thomas, who had worked there for 30 years, stopped by their room around 7. "You two planning to sleep here?" he asked with a gentle smile. "Just a little longer, Thomas," Sarah replied. "We're on to something important." Thomas glanced at the image on the screen, and his smile faded. He stepped closer, squinting at the photograph. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice suddenly serious. "It was in the uncatalogued donations from the Beauregard estate," Sarah explained. "Why?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the image. "My grandmother used to tell stories," he said finally, "about young women who vanished in the old days. She said they were taken by devils in fine clothes, men who hid behind respectability while they did terrible things. She said their screams could sometimes be heard from certain houses in the quarter, but the police never came. Too many important people involved." He paused, his weathered face reflecting both the present moment and memories from decades past. My grandmother was a laundress, worked for some of the finest families in the city. She saw things, heard things. The rich folks, they didn't pay much attention to the help, talked freely around them like they were furniture. My grandmother heard about girls who went to parties and never came home. She heard whispers about certain men who had tastes that good society wouldn't acknowledge, but wouldn't stop either. Thomas pulled a chair closer to the computer screen, his eyes never leaving the photograph. She told me that some of the girls' families would come looking, desperate for any information, but doors would close. People who had been friendly would suddenly have nothing to say. Money changed hands, threats were made, and the investigations would just, he snapped his fingers, disappear, like the girls themselves. Sarah and Marcus listened in silence, recognizing the value of oral history, the stories passed down through generations that often contained truths absent from official records. Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. My grandmother said there was one house in particular where bad things happened. She wouldn't speak its address out loud, like saying it might summon something evil, but she described it. A mansion with black iron gates and a garden that seemed too perfect, too controlled. She said the flowers there grew on the blood of innocence. Did she ever mention specific houses? Marcus asked, his attention fully focused on Thomas now. One, Thomas said, on Dauphine Street, a mansion that burned down in the 1920s. She said it had been cursed since the 1880s, that evil had soaked into its very walls. People avoided it even before the fire. After the fire, they built over it quickly, like they wanted to bury the memory. What's there now? Sarah asked. An apartment building. Expensive condos, actually, renovated about 10 years ago. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had an hour ago. After Thomas left, they continued their research with renewed intensity. Marcus found the architectural survey he had been looking for. 3 buildings in the French Quarter had featured that specific rose and thorn wallpaper pattern. One had been torn down in 1901. One had been converted into a hotel in the 1920s. The third had been a private mansion on Dauphine Street, owned by a family named Rousseau. The mansion that burned down, Sarah said quietly. Marcus pulled up everything he could find on the Rousseau family. They had been prominent in New Orleans society, wealthy plantation owners who had maintained their fortune even after the Civil War through shipping and trade. The family patriarch in the 1880s had been Christophe Rousseau, a man described in contemporary accounts as charming and cultured, a patron of the arts who hosted lavish parties. The newspaper society pages painted a picture of a refined gentleman. Rousseau spoke multiple languages fluently. He collected rare books and European art. He donated generously to charities and cultural institutions. His parties were legendary, attended by politicians, judges, business leaders, and visiting dignitaries. He moved in the highest circles of New Orleans society, untouchable in his wealth and connections. But as Marcus dug deeper, discrepancies began to emerge. Financial records showed unusual patterns, large cash withdrawals with no clear purpose, payments to individuals whose names appeared nowhere else in any public documents, purchases of supplies, medicines, and materials that seemed excessive for a single-person household. The transactions were all legal, all properly recorded, but they suggested activities that Rousseau had been careful to keep private. Sarah found records of a lawsuit filed against Rousseau in 1881 by a former servant, a young woman who claimed he had assaulted her. The case had been dismissed almost immediately, the woman's testimony deemed unreliable. A notation in the court file indicated that the woman had been paid a settlement and had left the city. No further records of her existed. It was as if she had been erased. More troubling were the employment records Marcus had mentioned earlier. Rousseau employed an unusually high number of young women as household staff. Most stayed less than 6 months. Some left with no notice. Their departure dates marked in household ledgers, but no forwarding address or references provided. The turnover was remarkable, even for an era when domestic service was precarious and unstable work. The more Marcus read, the more a picture began to emerge. Christophe Rousseau had been a widower, his wife having died in childbirth in 1875. He had no children. He lived in the mansion with a rotating staff of servants, many of whom seemed to leave his employment abruptly and without explanation. There were gaps in the employment records, Sarah noted. Entire months where there's no documentation of household staff, or the documentation was destroyed, Marcus suggested, along with everything else. They found a Society page article from 1883 that mentioned a party at the Rousseau mansion. The date was October 15th. The photograph of the Mercier sisters was dated October 20th. The sisters had disappeared on November 7th. He knew them, Sarah said, or at least he knew of them. They might have attended that party. Marcus found the guest list, preserved in the papers of another Society family. The Mercier family was listed. All 4 daughters had been in attendance. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they formed was horrifying. Sarah felt physically ill as the implications became clear. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was something planned, orchestrated, a predator selecting his victims. "We need to go to that building on Dauphine Street," Marcus said, "the one that was built over the old mansion. There might be something in the foundations, in the basement. Sometimes when they rebuild, they don't excavate everything." "Now?" Sarah asked. Marcus looked at her with grim determination. "Those hands in the photograph didn't belong to ghosts, Sarah. They belonged to real people. And if Rousseau was behind this, if he took those women, there's a chance something remains. Evidence, maybe even remains." The thought made Sarah's stomach turn, but she nodded. "You're right, but we should involve the police. This is way beyond historical research. With what evidence? A photograph from 1883. They'll think we're crazy. We need something concrete first." The rain had stopped by the time they left the Historical Society, but the streets were slick and gleaming under the gas lamp-styled streetlights. The French Quarter at night had a different character. The tourist crowds thinning out, the shadows deepening between buildings. The air smelled of rain and river water and something older, something that seemed to rise from the very stones of the city. The building on Dauphine Street was an elegant structure, its facade renovated to blend historic architecture with modern amenities. A discreet sign indicated luxury condominiums. Marcus had called ahead, using his credentials as a historian to arrange access to the basement storage areas with the building manager. The manager, a nervous young man named David, met them at the entrance. He led them through the lobby and down a service stairwell that descended below street level. The basement was clean and well-maintained, divided into storage units for the residents. "The old foundation is back here," David explained, leading them past rows of locked doors. When they did the renovation, they discovered parts of the original mansion's basement. The developers wanted to tear it all out, but the Historical Preservation Society insisted on keeping some of it intact. He unlocked a heavy door at the far end of the corridor. Beyond it, the character of the space changed dramatically. The modern construction gave way to old brick walls, uneven floors, and the musty smell of age. The temperature dropped noticeably. "This section isn't used for anything," David said, flipping on a bare light bulb that did little to dispel the shadows. "The structural engineer said it was sound, but it gives people the creeps, so we just sealed it off." Marcus pulled out a high-powered flashlight and swept it across the space. The basement was larger than Sarah had expected, extending back into darkness beyond the reach of the overhead light. The walls showed signs of smoke damage, remnants of the fire that had destroyed the mansion above. But there was more. As Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she began to notice details that made her training as a profiler kick in. The brick walls weren't uniform. Sections had been rebuilt or reinforced at different times, visible in the varying colors and patterns of the brickwork. Some areas showed water damage from decades of seasonal flooding. Others were strangely pristine, as if they had been protected or sealed off from the elements. The floor was uneven, with depressions in some areas that could have been caused by settling or by something heavier, more permanent, that had once rested there. Marcus moved slowly through the space, his flashlight beam revealing more troubling details. There were hooks set into the ceiling beams, their metal pitted with rust but still firmly anchored. Along one wall, barely visible under layers of accumulated grime, were scratches in the brick. Sarah knelt down to examine them more closely, her heart sinking as she recognized what they were. Fingernail marks, dozens of them, scored into the mortar between bricks by desperate hands. David, the building manager, stood near the doorway, his face pale. "I've been down here before," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We used the front part for storage, but I never went back this far, never really looked at it closely." Marcus documented everything with his camera, the flash illuminating corners that hadn't seen proper light in over a century. Sarah found more chain mounts and something else. Bolts driven into the floor, arranged in patterns that suggested furniture or equipment had once been secured there. The implications were horrifying. They moved deeper into the space, their footsteps echoing. Sarah noticed markings on the floor, patterns in the old brick that seemed deliberate. Marcus saw them too and knelt down, brushing away years of accumulated dust. "These are chains mounts," he said quietly. "Multiple sets. They used to secure things to the floor, or people," Sarah added, her voice barely above a whisper. They continued searching, documenting everything with photographs and measurements. In a far corner, partially hidden behind a later addition of concrete, Marcus found a door. It was small, barely 5 feet high, made of thick wood that had warped with age and heat damage. "David, we need to open this," Marcus said. The manager hesitated. "I don't have a key. I'm not even sure we were told about this door." Marcus examined the old lock. It was corroded, the mechanism likely seized after more than a century. He looked at Sarah, then at David. "I'm going to force it. If you want to object, now's the time." David shook his head. "Just be careful. And if you find anything weird, we're calling the police immediately." Marcus applied pressure to the door, using a pry bar he had brought from his vehicle. The wood groaned, but held. He increased the force. And finally, with a sharp crack, the lock gave way. The door swung inward on rusted hinges, releasing a wave of stale air that made all 3 of them step back. Beyond the door was a small room, perhaps 10 feet square. Marcus shone his flashlight inside, and Sarah heard him draw in a sharp breath. The walls were covered in the same rose and thorn wallpaper from the photograph, though badly deteriorated, hanging in strips from the damp walls. In the center of the room was a heavy wooden table, and against one wall stood what appeared to be a large wardrobe, its doors hanging open. Inside the wardrobe were dresses, Victorian dresses, preserved in the dry darkness, their colors faded but their forms intact. Sarah counted 4 of them. "Jesus Christ," David whispered. "What is this place?" Marcus was examining the table, his flashlight revealing dark stains in the wood. Sarah didn't want to think about what those stains might be. Scattered across the table surface were small objects, partially concealed by dust and debris. Marcus carefully brushed away the accumulation, revealing jewelry, rings, bracelets, a locket. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed each item. Among them was a ring that made her blood run cold. The same ring from the photograph, with its distinctive large stone and ornate setting. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her gloved hand. Inside the band was an engraving, still legible despite the passage of time. "C.R.," she read aloud. "Christophe Rousseau." "We're calling the police now," Marcus said firmly. "This is a crime scene, a historical crime scene, but a crime scene nonetheless." David was already on his phone, his voice shaking as he spoke to the emergency dispatcher. Sarah continued documenting everything, her professional training taking over, even as her mind reeled from the implications. This room had been hidden, sealed away, preserving evidence of horrors that had occurred more than 140 years ago. In the back of the wardrobe, behind the dresses, Sarah found something else, a leather-bound book, its pages stiff with age. She opened it carefully, and her stomach lurched. It was a journal written in a precise hand in French. The entries were dated beginning in 1882. "Marcus," she called, "you need to see this." They read together, their translation halting but sufficient. The journal belonged to Christophe Rousseau, and it detailed his activities with chilling precision. He had been selecting young women from respectable families, luring them to his home under various pretenses. Once there, they had been imprisoned, subjected to unspeakable treatment, and eventually murdered. Their bodies, according to his meticulous notes, had been disposed of in the river, weighted down with chains and left to the currents and the creatures below. The entries were written in a cold, clinical style that was somehow more disturbing than emotional confessions would have been. Rousseau documented his crimes as if conducting scientific experiments, noting methods, durations, and results with detached precision. He recorded how long his victims survived under various conditions. He described their reactions to different forms of psychological torture. He catalogued their suffering with the methodical attention of a researcher, documenting laboratory specimens. What made it even more horrifying was the evidence of planning. Rousseau had scouted potential victims for months, sometimes years, before acting. He attended society functions specifically to identify suitable targets. He cultivated relationships with families, presenting himself as a respectable suitor or family friend, gaining trust that he would later exploit catastrophically. The Mercier sisters were listed by name, their entries spanning several pages. Rousseau had first encountered them at a charity function in 1882. He had befriended their father, Jean-Baptiste, presenting himself as a potential business partner. He had visited their home multiple times, always proper, always gracious, slowly becoming a familiar presence in their lives. By the time he invited them to his mansion for the October party, they had no reason to fear him. The journal described in excruciating detail what had happened after the party, how he had separated the youngest, Sophie, from her sisters, claiming to show her a rare painting in a private gallery, how his accomplices had then detained the other three, how their screams had been muffled by the thick walls and the carefully cultivated isolation of his property, how they had been held for weeks, each day bringing new horrors that Rousseau documented with meticulous care. The extra hands in the photograph had belonged to his accomplices, men he referred to only by initials, prominent citizens, men of wealth and influence who shared his predilections and who helped ensure his activities remained hidden from scrutiny. The police had been paid to look the other way. Officials had been blackmailed into silence. An entire system of power and privilege had conspired to protect these monsters while young women suffered and died. The journal revealed the scope of the conspiracy. At least 6 other men were directly involved, with dozens more complicit through their deliberate ignorance or active participation in the cover-up. Rousseau named judges who dismissed complaints, police officers who destroyed evidence, politicians who used their influence to shut down investigations. He detailed payments made, favors exchanged, threats delivered. Some of the accomplices had participated directly in the crimes. The initials in the journal corresponded to known figures in New Orleans society. B.M. was almost certainly Bernard Marchand, a prominent banker. J.L. was likely Jules Lavigne, a city councilman. T.D. matched the initials of Theodore Deschamps, a federal judge. These were men whose names graced buildings and streets, whose descendants still held positions of power and respect in the city. The journal also revealed a network that extended beyond New Orleans. Rousseau corresponded with like-minded individuals in other cities, sharing techniques and recommendations. There were references to similar operations in Mobile, Savannah, and Charleston. The scope of the predation was regional, possibly national, enabled by the wealth and mobility of the perpetrators and the invisibility of their victims once removed from their communities. Most chilling were the entries describing how they selected victims. Young women from respectable but not wealthy families were preferred. Their disappearances would be noticed, but not powerful enough to demand serious investigation. The families lacked the resources and connections to push back against the institutional resistance they encountered. The victims were chosen specifically for their vulnerability within the social hierarchy, targeted because their suffering could be dismissed or explained away. Sarah felt tears running down her face as she read. These weren't just historical abstractions. These had been real people, with families who loved them, with futures that had been stolen, and the men responsible had never faced justice. Rousseau had died in a fire that the journal suggested might have been set deliberately by someone seeking to end his reign of terror. But his accomplices had lived on, their reputations intact, their crimes buried along with their victims. The police arrived 20 minutes later, followed shortly by detectives and forensic specialists. The basement was quickly transformed into an active investigation site, despite the age of the crimes. The journal, the jewelry, the dresses, all of it was carefully catalogued and removed as evidence. Detective Lisa Moreau, a veteran investigator with the New Orleans Police Department, took their statements. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. After hearing their account, she sat back in her chair and studied them both. "You understand this is unprecedented," she said, "investigating crimes from 1883. There's no one to prosecute. Everyone involved has been dead for over a century." "But there are families," Sarah argued, "descendants of the victims who never knew what happened to their ancestors. They deserve the truth." Moreau nodded slowly. "You're right. And beyond that, this is part of our city's history, ugly as it is. These crimes happened. These women existed. They deserve to be remembered as more than just missing persons in an old file." Over the following weeks, the discovery made national news. The photograph of the Mercier sisters, with its hidden hands revealed, became an iconic image representing not just their tragedy, but the broader reality of how power and privilege had been used to enable and conceal horrific crimes throughout history. Forensic experts examined the journal, verifying its authenticity. Historians worked to identify Rousseau's accomplices through the initials and circumstantial evidence in the text. While no criminal charges could be filed, the truth about their involvement was made public, tarnishing family legacies and forcing a reckoning with the past. The most significant discovery came when a team of divers working with police located what appeared to be a dumping site in the Mississippi River, identified through geographical references in Rousseau's journal. The underwater graveyard yielded the remains of multiple young women, their bones still wrapped in chains. Dental records and DNA analysis, where possible through living descendants, confirmed that at least 3 of the victims were the Mercier sisters. Sarah attended the reburial ceremony on a cold January morning. The remains of Adeline, Celeste, and Marguerite Mercier were laid to rest in St. Louis Cemetery, their grave marked with a memorial listing all the known victims of Christophe Rousseau and his circle. Sophie's remains had not been conclusively identified, but her name was included on the memorial as well. Descendants of the Mercier family, traced through genealogical research, came from across the country to attend. An elderly woman named Claire Mercier, a great-great-grandniece of the sisters, approached Sarah after the service. "Thank you," she said simply, gripping Sarah's hand. "My grandmother always said something terrible had happened, that the family carried a wound we couldn't name. Now we know. Now they can rest." Marcus stood beside Sarah as the last of the attendees left the cemetery. The case had changed him. The jovial academic she had known was gone, replaced by someone grimmer, more aware of the depths of human cruelty, but also the importance of bearing witness to it. "I've been thinking about what this means," he said. "Not just this case, but what it represents. How many other photographs are sitting in archives, hiding evidence of crimes we've never investigated? How much injustice has been buried and forgotten?" "Too much," Sarah replied. "But we found this one. We brought these women home." They stood in silence for a moment, honoring the dead. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice stronger. "I want to establish a foundation, something dedicated to investigating historical disappearances, giving voice to the forgotten. Will you help me?" Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes, the foundation they created, named for the Mercier sisters, became a model for how historical research could intersect with cold case investigation. Over the following years, they identified and solved dozens of cases from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, bringing closure to families and shining light on patterns of abuse that had been systematically concealed. But that first case, the photograph with its hidden hands, remained the most significant. It was taught in universities as an example of how careful analysis of historical sources could reveal truths that challenged official narratives. The image itself became a symbol of resistance against the idea that some crimes were too old to matter, that power and privilege could permanently shield the guilty from accountability. Sarah often thought about the moment she had first enhanced that photograph, the instant when the hidden hands became visible. It had felt like the sisters were reaching across time, demanding to be seen, refusing to be forgotten. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not just solving a mystery, but honoring the humanity of those who had been reduced to nothing more than entries in a madman's journal. The rain returned to New Orleans that spring, as it always did, washing the streets clean and making the old buildings glisten. Sarah stood at her office window, watching the storm roll in from the river, and thought about freedom. The freedom to live without fear. The freedom to be remembered as more than a victim. The freedom that comes from truth, however painful, however delayed. The Mercier sisters had that freedom now. Their story was known. Their graves were marked. Their names would not be lost. In the archive where it all began, the photograph remained, properly preserved and documented. But it was no longer a mystery. The hands were no longer hidden. The truth, terrible as it was, had been brought into the light, and in New Orleans, where the past never truly dies but rises again and again from the dark waters, their story became part of the city's eternal conversation with itself about justice, memory, and the price of looking away from suffering. The work continued. There were always more photographs to examine, more archives to search, more voices from the past waiting to be heard. Sarah and Marcus threw themselves into it with the dedication of people who had seen what could be accomplished when someone cared enough to look closer, to question the official story, to give the forgotten a chance to speak. The Mercier Foundation's offices on Magazine Street became a hub for researchers, genealogists, and family members seeking answers about lost loved ones. They worked with police departments across the country, teaching modern investigators how to approach historical cold cases, how to read old documents with fresh eyes, how to use new technology to solve old crimes. One afternoon, Nearly 2 years after the discovery of the photograph, Sarah received a package. It was from Claire Mercier, the elderly descendant who had attended the reburial. Inside was a letter and another photograph, this one in color, recent. "Dear Dr. Mitchell," the letter began, "I wanted you to have this. It's a picture of my family, all of us together last Thanksgiving. We never used to gather like this." The tragedy of what happened to Adeline, Celeste, Marguerite and Sophie had created a silence in our family that lasted for generations. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't acknowledge the loss. But now we do. Now we remember them not just as victims, but as the full people they were. My grandmother found some of their letters, and we've learned that Adeline loved to paint, that Celeste played the piano beautifully, that Marguerite wanted to be a teacher, and that Sophie dreamed of traveling to Paris. They were real. They mattered. You gave us permission to grieve them properly and to celebrate their lives, not just mourn their deaths. Thank you for giving them back to us. Sarah pinned the photograph to the bulletin board in her office, next to the enhanced image of the Mercier sisters from 1883. The contrast was stark. One image captured fear and captivity, the other showed joy and freedom. Both were part of the same story, separated by more than a century, but connected by the threads of memory and justice. Marcus stopped by her office that evening, carrying coffee and looking exhausted. They had been working on a new case, another disappearance from 1892, this time in Mobile, Alabama. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Young woman from a good family, no body ever found. Investigation that went nowhere. "I found something," he said, sitting down heavily in the chair across from her desk. Property records showing that one of Rousseau's accomplices, a man named Beaumont, had a vacation home in Mobile. The timing matches. Sarah felt the familiar mix of excitement and dread that came with these discoveries. Excitement at the possibility of solving another case, dread at what they might find. "We need to investigate this," she said. "I know. I've already contacted the Mobile Police Department. They're willing to work with us." As they discussed the logistics, Sarah's gaze drifted to the two photographs on her wall. The past and the present, tragedy and healing, death and life. This was the work. This was what mattered. Not just uncovering crimes, but restoring dignity to those who had been denied it, giving families the closure they needed to move forward. The work of the Mercier Foundation expanded beyond historical cases. They began advocating for better resources for missing persons investigations, pushing for policy changes that would make it harder for disappearances to be ignored or dismissed, especially those involving marginalized communities. They testified before legislative committees, presented at conferences, trained law enforcement agencies. Sarah found herself becoming a public figure, something she had never sought but came to accept as part of the responsibility. She gave interviews about the Mercier case, always careful to center the victims rather than the investigation. She spoke about the importance of believing families who reported their loved ones missing, about not dismissing cases based on assumptions about the victim's character or circumstances. The message resonated. Other researchers and investigators reached out, sharing their own discoveries of historical crimes. A network formed, people dedicated to the principle that every victim deserved justice, regardless of how long ago the crime occurred. 3 years after finding the photograph, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference on cold cases in Washington, D.C. The night before her presentation, she sat in her hotel room, reviewing her notes. The talk was titled Freedom and Accountability, What Historical Injustices Teach Us About Modern Justice. She had struggled with how to frame the message, how to connect the specific tragedy of the Mercier sisters to broader themes. Finally, she had realized that the connection was simple. Freedom meant nothing if it could be stripped away without consequence. The young women of New Orleans in the 1880s had been born into a society that promised them certain rights and protections, but those promises had been hollow. Men with power and money had been free to prey on them, secure in the knowledge that their positions shielded them from accountability. True freedom required justice. It required that the powerful be held to account. It required that victims be seen, heard, and remembered. And it required the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the past, to acknowledge that injustice had occurred and that its effects rippled forward through time. The next day, Sarah delivered her presentation to a packed auditorium. She showed the photograph of the Mercier sisters, pointing out the hidden hands, explaining the painstaking process of investigation that had led to the truth. She described finding the journal, the dresses, the jewelry. She talked about the reburial and the healing it had brought to the family. Then she broadened the scope. She presented data on modern missing persons cases, showing how patterns of dismissal and neglect mirrored those of the past. She highlighted cases where young women, particularly women of color and those from lower economic backgrounds, had disappeared with minimal investigation. She drew direct lines between the systemic failures that had enabled Rousseau and those that continued to fail victims today. The question she posed to the audience was simple: what are we willing to do differently? The response was overwhelming. Attendees approached her afterward with their own stories, their own cases, their own commitment to change. Law enforcement officials promised to review their cold case procedures. Policymakers discussed new legislation to fund missing persons investigations. Family members thanked her for giving voice to their grief and their anger. But the moment that stayed with Sarah came from an unexpected source. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, waited until everyone else had left before approaching. She stood for a moment, seemingly struggling with what to say. "My sister disappeared 5 years ago," she finally said. "The police said she probably ran away. They never really investigated. After hearing you speak, I realize I need to keep pushing. I need to make them see her the way you saw the Mercier sisters, as a person who mattered, as someone worth finding." Sarah took the woman's hand. "Tell me about your sister," she said. They talked for nearly an hour. Sarah took notes, got contact information, promised to have the Mercier Foundation look into the case. As the young woman left, visibly lighter despite the weight of her loss, Sarah felt the purpose of her work crystallize even further. This wasn't just about solving old mysteries. It was about changing the present. It was about creating a world where every person's freedom was protected, where every disappearance was investigated with equal vigor, where power and privilege could not buy immunity from justice. The Mercier Foundation took on the case of the young woman's sister, working with local investigators to reopen the investigation. They found evidence that had been overlooked, witnesses who hadn't been interviewed, leads that had never been pursued. 6 months later, they located her. She was alive, being held against her will by a domestic partner the police had never bothered to seriously investigate. Her rescue made national news, but for Sarah, the real victory was simpler. Another person reclaimed, another family reunited, another example of what could be accomplished when people cared enough to look. The pattern repeated. Historical cases led to lessons that improved modern investigations. Modern cases validated the importance of never giving up on the past. The work fed itself, creating a growing movement of people committed to justice without a statute of limitations. Marcus thrived in this environment. His academic background gave the foundation credibility, but his passion gave it heart. He spent his days in archives and his evenings training police officers. He wrote papers and gave lectures and appeared in documentaries. And he never, ever stopped asking the question that had driven him from the beginning. What happened to these people, and why did we allow it to be forgotten? 5 years after the discovery, The Mercier Foundation had helped solve or bring new attention to more than 60 historical cases. They had recovered the remains of 17 victims, bringing closure to families who had lived with uncertainty for generations. They had identified patterns of criminal behavior that spanned decades, showing how certain predators had operated with impunity because of their social positions. They had also helped solve 12 modern missing persons cases, demonstrating that the skills and dedication required to investigate historical disappearances translated directly to contemporary work. The line between past and present blurred in their work, becoming less a division than a continuum of human suffering that demanded response. Sarah's office was now filled with photographs. Not just the Mercier sisters, though their image held pride of place, but dozens of others. Faces from different eras, different places, different circumstances, but all connected by the simple fact that someone had taken the time to see them, to investigate their stories, to refuse to let them be forgotten. On quiet evenings, when the office was empty and the street outside had settled into the peculiar hush that sometimes descended on the city, Sarah would look at those faces and think about the meaning of freedom. Real freedom, not the abstract concept, but the lived experience of being able to move through the world without fear, to trust that if something terrible happened, someone would care enough to seek justice. That was the freedom the Mercier sisters had been denied. That was the freedom too many people, even now, could not take for granted. And that was the freedom the Foundation worked every day to protect and expand. The work was hard. There were cases they couldn't solve, families they couldn't help, truths that remained buried despite their best efforts. But there were also victories, moments of closure and healing that made every hour of research, every difficult conversation, every confrontation with human evil worth enduring. Sarah thought often about that rainy day in the archives when she had first noticed something wrong with the photograph. If she had moved on, if she had dismissed her instinct, the Mercier sisters would still be lost. Their story would have remained untold. Their suffering would have continued to be invisible. But she hadn't moved on. She had looked closer, and that simple act of attention, of caring enough to investigate what seemed wrong, had changed everything. That was the lesson she tried to teach others in her talks and her writing and her daily work. Pay attention. Question the official story. Believe that truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges powerful institutions or cherished narratives. And never, ever accept that some victims are too far in the past to deserve justice. The photograph of the Mercier sisters, with its hidden hands now revealed and understood, had become more than evidence of a crime. It had become a symbol of the power of persistence, of the importance of remembering, of the possibility that justice could reach across any span of time if people were willing to pursue it. In the end, that was what freedom meant to Sarah. Not the absence of constraint, but the presence of accountability. The knowledge that if someone tried to strip away your rights, your dignity, your very life, there would be people who cared enough to seek the truth and demand justice. The Mercier sisters were free now, in the only way that mattered. Their story was known. Their names were remembered. The men who had harmed them could no longer hide behind respectability and privilege. The truth had been brought into the light, and it would remain there, a testament to their lives and a warning to those who might think themselves above accountability. And in New Orleans, in a foundation named for 4 sisters who had been denied freedom in life, but who had finally claimed it in death, the work continued. The photographs accumulated, the cases multiplied, the families found closure, and the message spread. Every victim matters. Every story deserves to be told. Justice has no expiration date. Sarah stood at the window of the Foundation's office, watching the sun set over the city. The buildings glowed golden in the fading light, beautiful and terrible in their antiquity, holding within them countless stories of joy and suffering, freedom and captivity. New Orleans had always been a city of contradictions, a place where the past was never truly past, where every stone seemed to whisper secrets. She thought about the young women who had walked these same streets in 1883, who had looked at these same buildings, who had lived and hoped and dreamed before their lives were stolen. She thought about the modern young women who walked here now, mostly safe, mostly free, but still vulnerable to predators who counted on indifference and silence to shield their crimes. The work of protecting freedom was never finished. Every generation had to fight for it anew, had to remain vigilant against those who would exploit the vulnerable, had to insist that justice applied to everyone, regardless of wealth or power or social position. The Mercier sisters had lost that fight in their own time, but through the discovery of their photograph, through the revelation of the truth about their fate, they had become part of a larger struggle that continued. Their story educated and inspired. Their memory served justice. As darkness fell over the city, Sarah returned to her desk. There was another case waiting, another set of questions to answer, another family seeking closure. The work never ended, but that was as it should be. The fight for freedom, for justice, for human dignity, these were not battles that could be won once and for all. They required constant effort, constant attention, constant willingness to look closer and question, and refuse to accept that some crimes were too old, some victims too forgotten to matter. Sarah opened the new case file and began to read. Somewhere in the past, someone was waiting to be found, someone who deserved to have their story told, their suffering acknowledged, their memory honored. And she would keep looking until they were found, until justice was served, until one more person was reclaimed from the silence and the shadows. That was the promise she had made, standing in that cemetery on a cold January morning, looking at the graves of the Mercier sisters. That was the work that gave meaning to their tragedy and hope to their descendants. Every victim deserves justice. Every story deserves to be told. Freedom is not free. It is earned through vigilance, defended through courage, and preserved through the willingness to confront even the darkest chapters of our shared history. The hands in the photograph were no longer hidden. The truth was known, and the work continued, as it always would, as it always must, until the day when no one could disappear without someone caring enough to seek them, to fight for them, to bring them home.